I'd like to ask you, John, because obviously this is an industry you study extremely intently. What have you seen recently that you see is meaningful innovation? Because there's an awful lot of just moving stuff around, but every once in a while you see something that is actually fairly momentous. So have you seen anything recently that you see as a big platform idea or something that might be triggering some of these major shifts?
There was an article in, I think, July of 2009 in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how Apple and RIM were taking grossly disproportionate share of sort of the traditional handset manufacturing industry's profits. And you know, it resonated with me because it was plainly obvious to me. I thought, boy, you know, I wonder if it'll get dark tonight. You know, so it was one of these things where, you know, it pained me that somebody else's name was attached to that article and not mine. Another thing that pained me was that I didn't write Ray Ozzy's parting memo to Microsoft. Right? So, you know, I started in this business as an analyst about 10 years ago. And I was a widget counter, right? I was the guy who said, hey, you know, RIM has this much market share, Nokia has this much market share. And you know, this article in the Wall Street Journal talked about, you know, how these companies were taking disproportionate share of the industry's value. And that's because we have seen and we continue to see a wholesale transformation of the industry that, you know, it's kind of like Prince, right? This is the sector formerly known as the wireless industry. We have this commingling of content, media, internet, computing domains that are creating fundamental value shifts in the way, fundamental shifts in the way traditional industry structures are able to monetize. So I've gone, perhaps a little bit frustratingly, from widget counter to a guy who has to speak you know, a bit of semi-fluent semiconductor, semi-fluent internet, semi-fluent advertising, semi-fluent OEM operator, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to be a bit of a polyglot in that way. But to answer your question more specifically, and to maybe get a bit propeller-headed for a minute, in terms of some, or maybe an area where we see real innovation or potential for real innovation taking place. If you get down into the guts, I pay a lot of attention to what goes on in sort of the comms semiconductor sector, because I think that gives you a pretty good window into what's going to be a reality 1 or 2 years down the road. So we have the advent of certainly we've seen, you know, you walk into a wireless retail store today and you're going to see gigahertz processor on the box or, you know, at the retail point of sale. That's going to go from gigahertz to dual core, and then we're going to go from dual core to quad core. So we have the advent of parallel computing making its way into the mobile device, you know, whether that device is a tablet or, you know, some kind of a laptop or certainly a smartphone. So we have that, and we have the potential to marry that with operating systems that can let developers, and again, so we have this kind of, think of it as like a 3-layered cake, right? We have, you know, mostly on the back of innovation by ARM, and this is not the Cayman ARM, which is arguably a much, much more meaningful innovation. This is ARM, the UK-based company that has its processor cores basically universally distributed across mobile computing devices worldwide. So, you know, this innovation here, where we have you know, parallel computing, CPU, GPU, multiple cores, software like QNX, which I think, you know, may go down in history as one of the most prescient technology acquisitions, you know, in recent, you know, in modern time anyway, and potentially the ability to let developers, you know, drill down and unlock the potential of those multiple cores. We're going to get dual core and 3, you know, 4 cores and such like, and to a consumer, it's kind of like the megapixel battle, right? You know, 8 is always better than 5. 2 is always better than 1. But the matter of fact is, it's one thing to have the compute power. It's another thing to fully unlock it. And I think the company that can get to that stage first, and it is highly non-trivial, you know, is in a position to unlock lots and lots of meaningful innovation.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that we've found particularly fascinating over the last few years is that you can have an idea, you can put a concept out, but then the people take it over. And that's where it gets really exciting. Right. And one of the things I find fascinating is that you can have some really, really good ideas, but somebody looks at it from another angle, from another place. And in your book, Stephen, you talk about the concept of collisions at the periphery, where people who usually wouldn't be involved get together. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, there's a wonderful study a couple of years ago by a Stanford business school professor named Martin Roif. And Roif was interested in the social networks of unusually innovative people. And this was before Facebook and Twitter, so these were the people they actually knew, not their friends on Facebook and Twitter. And he did this he basically looked at two groups, entrepreneurs and people inside large organizations who were innovative, and then a group that was, to put it gently, less innovative in their lives. By the way, if you get invited to be part of this experiment, that's the part you don't want to be, You seem very dull. Could I ask you about your friends? Hang up the phone if they call you up to ask you for that. And what he found was, he mapped all these people's connections, and what he found was that there was this signature pattern in the social networks of the innovators, which was that they had a much larger set of kind of weak tie, loose connections to a much more diverse range of professions. Mm-hmm. So they were, in an ad agency somewhere, but they knew an architect and a popular science writer and a poet and a plumber, whereas the less innovative group just knew other advertising people. And you can understand from everything we've already said, you can understand why that is. It's something about the diversity of those experiences. So you're having a beer with some friend who's working on a completely different kind of problem, but you get into a conversation and it turns out there's something in their approach or some tool or technology or just a way of thinking about the problem that turns out to be useful in your own space. Yeah, yeah. And so, in a sense, what that leads you to is a non-political argument for diversity, right? It's not just that we'll be more tolerant as a society if we surround ourselves with people who are different from us, although that's no doubt true and a laudable goal, but it's also that on some basic level we'll be smarter, we'll be more innovative and creative in the way that we approach the world if we have a more diverse set of tools and experiences to draw upon.
Yeah. There are so many great examples of outcomes where you get these completely non-parallel disciplines coming together. A friend of mine is actually a quantum mechanic, most unlikely place to be working on climate change, and yet apparently it's exactly the sort of thing that is bringing out whole new dimensions, helping people look at it from quite a different angle. When you were talking about innovation, Tom, in your book, The Art of Innovation, you talk a lot about brainstorming, but you explain real brainstorming. And I think most of you are probably familiar with the situation where somebody says, let's all get in a room and we'll talk about stuff, let's brainstorm. And of course, it can be intensely frustrating. There's a right way to try and get this to happen, right?
Sure. When it comes to brainstorming, a lot of people do it badly, and any technique used badly tends to not lead to good results. And so I think if you're invited to a brainstormer, one thing would be a question to ask yourself is this really a brainstormer or not? Because the social ecology of an actual brainstormer we find to be the opposite of the social ecology of a meeting. Right? In a meeting, the boss gets to speak first and typically runs it. Right? In a meeting, it's appropriate to take notes. Right? It shows respect for the topic that's happening. In a meeting, if an idea comes up that you know to be truly bad, you owe it to your colleagues to bring it out. But in a brainstormer, none of those things are true. In a real brainstormer, the boss sometimes actually has to leave the room in order to have the free flow of ideas. Right? In a real brainstormer, we don't want anyone taking notes because they're removing themselves from the action. We want everybody in it. Right? In a brainstormer, you don't want to critique an idea yet. There'll be plenty of time for that later. In a brainstormer, you'll want an idea to flow, even if it seems like a bad idea at the time. Right? We were in a brainstorm a few years ago in which it was healthcare services. We were working for a hospital, and somebody had this crazy, stupid idea of having a mini bar in the hospital room. And everybody laughed because we were thinking about Jack Daniels in the hospital room. That wouldn't go. But later, one of the guys who ran catering said, now wait a minute, this thing about the mini bar. He said, if I could deliver the food when it was convenient for my team, not when the patient needed. If I could deliver an hour before lunchtime, wow, I could shave all the peaks off of our workday. He says I could actually reduce my costs. And so this hospital in Texas actually implemented this what was a crazy idea for a minute, morphed into a great idea which they implemented. So the other thing about brainstorming is it's a chance to tap into the whole brain of the company. Mm-hmm. Right? So my firm IDEO is now 500 people. You can't get all 500 people on your project. Sadly, you can't. But through the process of brainstorming, I can take somebody who's working in a completely different industry and I can bring them into your project just for an hour. And in that hour, you get access to all the ideas resident in their brain. So it sets up what I think Stephen would call a liquid network, where you get ideas stirring around a lot more than if you just stuck with just the project team.
And I should say just one other thing to that. I think the way you're describing it, Tom, is exactly right in the sense of expanding the number of minds that are available to work at the edges of this problem, right? And that's the beauty of open innovation, which you already talked about. Dean talked a lot about the kind of social good and civic good of innovation. I think we have an opportunity right now with governments, actually, to use those open innovation platforms to bring a lot more minds from outside government in to help solve problems that government's trying to do. There's a wonderful kind of Apps for America, Apps for Democracy competitions, one of which started in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, where they put out this call for developers, said, we've got all this data that the city has. We're very bad at sharing that data and making interesting, useful applications that use that data. So build an app, and we'll give $10,000 to the winner and $5,000 to the runner-up. And the only thing that you have to do by entering the competition is make this app freely available. And in the space of a month, they got all these fantastic apps, including one called Stumble Safely, which helps you if you're coming out of a bar having drunk too much and can't drive home. It calculates, based on crime data, the safest pedestrian route home, which is exactly the kind of thing that generally governments don't build, and two, that actually are kind of useful. And so they created all this innovation for less than $50,000, and it was by tapping all the intelligence that was outside the government to build on this platform that the government kind of naturally owns.
Well, and you don't have to spend any money at all sometimes. So we have an open innovation platform. It's called Open IDEO. And one of the recent questions we put out into the world, we're really interested in the intersection between mobile technologies and consumer health. Yeah. Right? And so we put a question out into the world of how could we use mobile technologies to help pregnant women in developing countries. Yeah. And we could have all the brainstormers in the world in IDEO, but we wouldn't come up with as many ideas as putting it out to 6 billion people in the world for input.